Back here now to jump into another segment, back into the AFC South, and talking a little bit more on the Indianapolis Colts. What are some realistic expectations for the Colts this year? Because I just finished talking about them in my offseason grades, that they're exciting. They're definitely in a point where a lot of people can have those hyperbole sort of expectations for them. Could they challenge the Texans or the Jaguars right away with how good this offense does look on paper? But there obviously has to do a lot more with that, and how they complement this offense, how they make it a little bit more efficient is the free agency activity, how you bring in players to make this team better. But from that standpoint, the Colts really didn't do too much of adding and too much of bringing in new guys to this whole project, because in free agency, they made it clear from the start that bringing back their guys was really their top priority this offseason. And if you look at that, based on their actions, they only signed two new players that weren't on their roster from last year. That was Joe Flacco and Raekwon Davis. Everybody else was just a re-signing. Everybody else was just being brought back. 10 players that were on the roster came back in free agency. Some of them included Julian Blackmon, Kenny Moore, Zaire Franklin, Michael Pittman, Grover Stewart, the defensive tackle, and a new deal for DeForest Buckner as well. Those are only some of the names that came back. Some of their important players for sure, but it just seems like some Colts fans wanted more to be brought in, but why they didn't exactly do that, well, general manager Chris Ballard sort of talked about it here in a quote that I found from one of his press conferences. As you guys can see on your screen, he said, "I know a lot of times people want change. They see the shiny car on the other side, but a lot of times, the players, they are the type of teammates they are, the type of work they will put in, the type of continuity, especially during the second half of the season, will bode well for us this year." Also, Chris Ballard didn't shy away about mentioning that they didn't see really much of a difference from bringing in different players in comparison to the players that they already had on their roster, they hit free agency, and that they wanted to bring back in that same sentiment. So, interesting quote, especially that last part when he said, especially during the second half of the season, will bode well for us this year. And the fact that he said, the continuity, that was one of the biggest words in that final sentiment that I wanted to highlight, because that is one of the most important things I think that I took away from what the Colts did, trying to figure out, why they didn't add anybody. How could you not want to make this team better in a way by adding some free agents that they certainly could have used from what they need, from their positions of need. But I can also understand what Chris Ballard is saying here in a way, because of the point of where the Indianapolis Colts are where they are at this moment. They're in a point of, just almost reaching the top of the hill. They're right on the, summit of it, and getting over it, and finally being, at that surface where they could really be considered contenders. They're on their way there. They're on their way to finally getting over that hump, I believe, with how impressive I think they did in the draft and just building on this offense. But doing that and getting to that point and finally getting over that hump is going to take that continuity, that chemistry, and that just overall comfort you have with the players that are going to fit into this system. When a lot of times when teams bring in new players, it looks great on paper. Obviously, not too long ago, we saw Russell Wilson being brought in for a lot of money to the Denver Broncos. It looks fantastic on paper, right? It looks awesome when you project him fitting into this team. They only need a quarterback, right? The Denver Broncos are only a quarterback away from being absolute contenders. Russell Wilson, he comes in. It doesn't matter how much we paid him. He's going to produce. He's going to take us to the Super Bowl and all that sort of things. But it looks great on paper. And then once you get into the season, he doesn't have a good season at all in his first year. It gets a little bit better in his second year, but the Broncos are still not considered a very good team. And that's sort of where I think Chris Ballard was going with this point, where you want to bring in for sure, or at least you don't want to lose the players that fit into this offense, fit into what you're trying to build. And I think it goes a long way when these players, like a Kenny Moore, like a Julian Blackmon, who was close to leaving at one point in free agency, where they have that opportunity to leave, but at the same time, they decide to sign back. They decide to buy into this project, this whole journey that they've been on with the Colts. And at that same time, you have those players wanting to come back, because not only is that great, that it shows that they want to be here, but also that they're buying into what you're building here in the Colts. And as the general manager from top to bottom in this organization, they've really bought into it. And again, they certainly could have left. I know players like Kenny Moore, Julian Blackmon, like I mentioned, Zaire Franklin, I'm sure had other offers out there to sign somewhere else, but they decided to stay here. And Michael Pittman as well. He was tagged, so he really didn't get a chance to test out the free agent market. But some of the deals, if you look that they handed out, and in terms of actual free agents, if you look at Michael Pittman's deal, he would have been the second biggest deal. Just talking about free agents, if he wasn't tagged, the contract that he got would have been the second biggest deal handed out in this free agent period. Only second to Calvin Ridley's deal that he had, but obviously Michael Pittman was tagged. And then you also look at Grover Stewart's deal that he received from the Colts, which was the second largest among free agent defensive tackles, to bring him back. And Kenny Moore, the second largest contract handed out to a defensive back in free agency, to return to the Colts as well. So I think that also just shows how important this team was, or how important these players were to this team, how important they were to the point where the Colts didn't really hesitate to spend a lot of money on them. It might seem like a lot in terms of, you see the second highest contract given out to a defensive back or a free agent or to a potential wide receiver, and you might think that's maybe overdoing it, but the Colts are really adamant that these are the players that they want. These are the players that they want to represent them. And they're doing a good thing, I believe, all in all, because they're certainly at a point where these expectations that we can have for them now, like I mentioned, they're right there almost at the summit. And I think this continuity, learning off of each other, building this bond with all the players, this core group of players, is going to be that next step into getting to the summit and then finally getting over it. Maybe next offseason you get that real game changer, that real X factor on the defensive side of the ball, ideally for me. And that way you start stepping into that next level of competing with the Texans, competing with, I don't know, somebody else in the AFC, the Steelers, the Jets, the Bills, all these teams that I think are around the same level. That's where the Colts are heading. That's their next step. And they're right there. They're really close. But for right now, the expectations that I see for the Colts coming into this year is that they're going to be great competition. From an offensive standpoint, they're going to be very tough to stop. They have a lot of weapons all over the field. From a wide receiver standpoint, from the running back standpoint, from the running game in general, just talking about Anthony Richardson and Jonathan Taylor. Then also, that's going to be great. They're probably not going to be in too many, they're not going to lose too many shootouts is what I'm trying to say, but at the same time, where I see them lacking is on that defensive side of the ball. You do bring back some great secondary pieces, but I think you could have used some more pass rushing to add to that defensive line, to add to DeForest Buckner. But, we'll see. Up until this point, I probably foresee them maybe competing for second at best. Second, because the Titans and the Jaguars are very similar to each other in a way where the Titans are starting to step into this new era. The Jaguars have already sort of been there last year, how good they were to how disappointing they were towards the end of last year. But the Colts, it really stunk for them last year that Anthony Richardson wasn't there, because he could have had some more time to develop, and they could have pushed those teams a little bit more. But now that he is there, that talent gap has sort of closed a little bit, and I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if they were challenging for second place, because I don't think anybody is really touching the Houston Texans, in my opinion. If the Colts can compete for that second spot, I don't think it's impossible for them to do that, but in between second or third, anywhere finishing in that area, I don't think it's going to be that hard for them to do by any means. Chris Ballard has done a great job of building this team up, drafting them, holding on to some draft picks, and really buying into the guys that he believes in. They're on the right path, and like I mentioned, they're almost there, but I would give it another season, another offseason before I really consider them for a wild card spot or something like that. But that's just me. Leave your guys' thoughts on where you guys see the Colts finishing this year, or how good really they could be? Could they surprise a lot of people, or do you think they're a lot further back than where I have them projected to be in this upcoming season? But we have one more segment to talk about on today's show. We're going to head into a quick break, and when we return, we're going to mention the new strategy that Dave Canales is trying to implement for the Carolina Panthers. What is his number one priority that he wants to see out of this offense to really help them blossom into a great or a greater than what they were last year picture out of them in 2024. So stay with the show. We're going to be right back after this to talk some more about the Carolina Panthers.